start by saying that I chose this title particularly because I think this is an area where India cannot possibly not lead, because the impacts of climate change are going to be particularly serious as far as India is concerned. And I'll also give you other reasons why it is in India's interest to be in the lead. Let me first show you some data which goes back in time to the beginning of industrialization. The upper part of this diagram gives you changes in global average temperature. We came up, therefore, in the IPCC with two important statements. The first was warming of the climate system is unequivocal. But the second statement that we came up with, which is also significant, is the fact that most of the warming that has taken place since the middle of the last century, and we use our words very carefully, is very likely the result of increase in anthropogenic concentration of greenhouse gases. The second diagram over here gives you average sea level rise, and this is the result of climate change on account of two factors. Firstly, we know that melting of the bodies of ice, including the glaciers in the Himalayan range to the north of this subcontinent, as well as thermal expansion of the oceans, is resulting in sea level rise. And the actual increase on average during the last century was about 17 centimeters. So 17 centimeters is a pretty serious problem. And if you see the last diagram over here, it gives you the decline in northern hemisphere snow cover. And this is the result of melting. But the important thing to remember is that there's a significant amount of melting that's taking place of this large mass of ice. Let's look at projections of temperature increase. We had forecast that based on a number of plausible scenarios of economic changes, of technological changes, of demographic changes, we would get a range of outcomes in terms of temperature increase by the end of this century. Now, if you look at 6.4 degrees Celsius, that's just bad news. Because if you look at the difference in average temperature between the ice age and the interglacial periods, it's less than 6.4 degrees Celsius. So, you know, we would be causing a geological change if we reached anywhere close to that upper end of the forecast or projection that we have. All right, let's see what else are the impacts of climate change. 2 months ago, we brought out a special report on extreme events, and we found that increasing vulnerability, exposure, or severity and frequency of climate events increases disaster risk. We have, for instance, come up with very clear findings that we would have many more frequent hot days throughout the 21st century. And in many regions, the time between the 20-year unusually warm days will decrease. And as a matter of fact, we have also said that those heat waves which currently take place once in 20 years will occur, if we don't do anything about this problem, will occur before the end of the century once in 2 years. If the world is going to face, if this country is going to face the impacts of climate change, as science tells us it will, then we necessarily, as risk averters, as responsible citizens and decision makers, must make sure that we put in place measures by which lives and property can be protected. So this is one cardinal rule by which we should put in place adaptation measures. This is something that's happened in our neighborhood in Pakistan in 2010 and 2011. And in 2010, I had occasion to overfly Pakistan, and that was a clear day. Soon after the floods, I really couldn't believe what I saw. There was nothing but a mass of muddy water all across a very large part of Pakistan that you could see. And of course, they had terrible floods in 2011 as well. And as a matter of fact, these were the result of what you might call extreme precipitation events. Another sad reality is the fact that as far as natural disaster related deaths are concerned, 95% of them take place in the developing countries and only 5% in the developed world. And this clearly shows the ability of the developed countries to be able to adapt to the impacts of climate change far better than those who are living in poor regions, and far better than those whose lives are totally dependent on the ecosystem services, the stability of ecosystems that are such an important part of their living. I think societies, if they have to adapt to the impacts of climate change, also have to develop a high level of resilience. And without making a general comment, may I say there are some rich societies in the world that are clearly not resilient. I mean, they get knocked over when any such disaster takes place. After all, if you have to create adaptive capacity, then it also has to rest on tradition, on cultural values and cultural strengths. Some societies are extremely vulnerable, and these are essentially those which are dependent on climate-sensitive resources. And here let me mention, we have projected very clearly that by 2020 in Africa, you would have anywhere from 75 to 250 million people who would be living in a state of water stress on account of climate change. Now just imagine when that happens, when such a large population is deprived of the very basic necessity of water, will that not lead to the possibility of conflict? So I think we have to be conscious of that. And when something like that happens, there is no part of the world that's going to remain insulated from the terrible things that would happen. I've already mentioned the case of possible abrupt or irreversible impacts, so I'll move on. But another area where we need to be concerned is the impacts on food security. Consequences for downstream agriculture, which relies on glacial melt and rivers for irrigation, will be unfavorable in most Asian countries. We would have to put in place much better recycling of water, where you could use grey water for purposes that don't necessarily impact on human health, but where water can be used for irrigation, for watering your lawns, for horticulture and a whole range of other applications. And I think we need a totally different and a much more enlightened approach to management of water if we want to deal with the impacts that we would have in the future. Urbanization would be particularly vulnerable, and we have concluded that the worst affected, the most vulnerable regions in the world will be the mega deltas, and that includes cities like Shanghai, Dhaka, Kolkata, because these are large agglomerations of population and a large amount of property, all very, very vulnerable to coastal flooding. So every time there is coastal flooding, you would have large numbers of people who would be affected. And therefore, you need to put in place infrastructure and other measures by which these locations are protected from the impacts of climate change. Now, let me turn to what would represent good news and why India must lead. If you look at mitigation potential, that means the opportunity and the potential to reduce emissions of greenhouse gases, sector by sector. What you see over here, and the largest, tallest graph that you see over here, is for the building sector. Buildings are one area where, irrespective of the price of carbon, which is shown over here for 3 different values, I'm sorry, those at the back may not be able to read this very clearly, but the x-axis has got 3 different assumed prices for carbon by which you can get corresponding potential for reduction in emissions of greenhouse gases. Well, the building sector seems to be insensitive to the price of carbon. In other words, this is really a case of negative cost opportunities. If you were to make buildings more efficient, it would be a win-win outcome. You would be able to reduce your bills, you would be able to reduce your energy bills, you would be able to reduce the amount of natural resources that are used for construction of that building, and certainly for the use of that building, both in terms of energy, water, and other resources. And you can actually enhance comfort if you were to do that. I'm very happy to acknowledge that in the Pune-Chinchwad region, there is a major effort to bring about the construction of energy efficient buildings. Just this morning I spoke to a group of builders who have been at the forefront of taking this concept of green buildings to reality. And this is very heartening. I would like to see Pune become the green capital of the country. And as I said, if India must lead, then perhaps Pune should lead the rest of India. Now, the point I'd like to make is, firstly, the world really doesn't have too much time to bring about mitigation. Now, what does that require? Well, that requires that we have to stabilize CO2 concentration levels more or less where we are today. And we also need to ensure, if we want to do this at least cost, that emissions of CO2 must peak no later than 2015. That's just 3 years away. So are we on that path? No. And therefore, I would submit that if India, which now has a very forward-looking national action plan on climate change, which I hope gets implemented in reality, we can certainly start moving in that direction as quickly as possible. And it's a myth to believe that the cost of this mitigation will be something that we can't afford, because in actual fact, if we were to have GDP growth globally up to 2030 without mitigation, you get what is shown over here in this red line. If you carry out stringent mitigation, then that line just bends a little downwards. And all this implies is that the level of prosperity that the world would reach in 2030 will at best be postponed by a few months or a year at the most. Now, it's obvious that that's certainly not a high price to pay for avoiding some of the worst impacts of climate change. But this is something that the world has to accept and sees as an opportunity. Because another reason why we need to ensure that we pursue this path of mitigation is because mitigation carries a huge lot of co-benefits. What are the co-benefits? Much higher energy security. The other co-benefit is that of health, because when you reduce emissions of greenhouse gases, you would also willy-nilly be reducing the emissions of other pollutants. One more co-benefit would be higher agricultural productivity and possibly even higher employment. So it's really a win-win opportunity. Future challenges in the energy sector, of course, are energy access, on what can be done to provide energy to those people who have no access to modern energy markets today. Energy import vulnerabilities I've dealt with, and climate change. Given the fact that we are becoming an important actor on the global stage, I don't think we can say we're not going to do anything. It's the developed countries that have to do everything, because there are huge co-benefits to us. And I think there is something that we can certainly take pride in by influencing the rest of the world if we were to do the right thing. Let me quickly go through what we can do to shape the future. Well, development continues along the current path with autonomous efficiency improvements. I also wanted to look at fossil fuel import dependency. If you look at the growth that's going to take place, and here again we've got different scenarios, the point I'd like to make is that if you had the right mix of policies, if we had the right pricing, for instance, if we spent enough on research and development, then if you look at the extreme set of figures, 2031, 32, then rather than have that tall figure which shows business as usual demand for energy, you can bring it down to about what is shown as the gray or blue figure, which is much, much lower. What we really need is key transformations. And I think the next couple of decades should be those where we transform the Indian economy such that, for instance, we have enhanced capacities in the railways, much greater mass transit and public transport systems, and we have to substitute petrol and diesel-driven vehicles with hybrid and battery-operated vehicles. We have to maximize the substitution of petrofuels with biofuels. All of this will reduce our oil import dependence. And in the coal sector, we certainly need to accelerate the utilization of India's domestic resources, and we should, as far as possible, reject additional thermal power generation based on imported coal. Now, the wind energy sector, where you've got a major manufacturer in Pune, Suzlon, has really gone through a period of revolution. Just look at the size of windmills. Going back to 1980 or so, what you had were 75 kilowatt machines. Today, we are talking about several megawatts. And all over the world, these are coming up on a large scale. I wanted to mention what Gandhiji said. You have two choices as a technological society. Either we wait till catastrophe overtakes us, and then, you know, that will only expose our systemic deficiencies, distortion, and self-deceptions. Or if we put in place a culture that has checks and balances to correct for systemic distortion prior to catastrophic failures, we would certainly all be better off. And I wish you all the best. Thank you.